The crystal decanter shattered against the marble fireplace, sending shards of glass and amber liquid spraying across the pristine white carpet. Eliza Blackwood watched in stunned silence as her mother's perfectly manicured hand trembled in midair, her face drained of color. "You wouldn't dare," Margaret Blackwood whispered, her voice barely audible over the grandfather clock's persistent ticking. Standing before them both with a smugness that made Eliza's stomach turn was Vera Holloway, the woman who had been folding their laundry and preparing their meals for over 30 years. "Try me," Vera replied, her familiar voice now laced with something Eliza had never heard before: power. 20 years of washing your dirty laundry, literally and figuratively. "I think 2 million is quite reasonable for my silence." Eliza felt her world tilt on its axis. What could this woman possibly know that was worth millions? Morning sunlight streamed through the bay windows of the Blackwood estate, casting long shadows across the antique furniture that had been in the family for generations. Eliza hadn't slept a wink after overhearing the confrontation between her mother and Vera the previous night. At 34, Eliza had always believed she knew everything about her family, their achievements, their quirks, even some of their flaws. The daughter of real estate magnate Robert Blackwood and his socialite wife Margaret, Eliza had grown up in a world of privilege. She'd married well too. James Sterling was handsome, successful, and from an equally prestigious family. They had what everyone called the perfect life. But now, as she sat at the breakfast table stirring her untouched coffee, that perfect life seemed like an elaborate house of cards. "You look terrible, darling," her mother commented as she glided into the room, appearing immaculately put together as always, not a hint of last night's distress visible on her carefully maintained face. "Rough night." Eliza studied her mother carefully. How could she act so normal? As if she hadn't been threatened by their maid just hours ago? "I heard you and Vera last night," Eliza said bluntly, watching her mother freeze mid-reach for the coffee pot. "What exactly does she have on you that's worth $2 million? Margaret's hand trembled slightly before she regained her composure, her society smile sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart. Just a misunderstanding between long-time associates." The dismissal was so typical of her mother. Problems were to be handled quietly, discreetly, and without involving the children, even when said children were well into adulthood. $2 million isn't a misunderstanding, mother. What is she threatening to expose? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken secrets. "Your father will handle it," Margaret finally said, her tone making it clear the discussion was over. But Eliza wasn't a child anymore, to be dismissed and placated with vague reassurances. As Margaret left the room with her coffee, Eliza made a decision. If her mother wouldn't tell her what was happening, she'd find out herself. The Blackwood estate was sprawling, with the east wing serving as the staff quarters. Vera had lived in the same suite of rooms for as long as Eliza could remember. It felt strange to be standing outside the maid's door, preparing to confront the woman who had baked her birthday cakes and patched her skinned knees. Eliza knocked firmly, steeling herself for the confrontation. When the door opened, Vera looked genuinely surprised to see her. "Miss Eliza," she said, her familiar warm smile at odds with the cold-hearted blackmailer from the night before. "This is unexpected." "I think we need to talk, Vera," Eliza said, pushing past her into the room. The maid's quarters were modest but comfortable, another indication of how the Blackwoods had always treated their staff well. "About what, exactly?" Vera asked, closing the door slowly. Eliza turned to face her, searching for signs of the woman she thought she knew. "About why you're blackmailing my mother for $2 million. Vera's smile faded, replaced by a calculating look that made Eliza's skin crawl. "Your mother told you? I overheard you last night. I want to know what's going on. What secrets are you threatening to expose?" Vera studied her for a long moment, then gestured to a small sitting area. "Perhaps you should take a seat, Miss Eliza. I'm not sure you're ready to hear this." Eliza remained standing, arms crossed. "Try me." "Very well," Vera sighed, seating herself in a worn armchair. "Your perfect family isn't so perfect after all. For 30 years, I've been the silent witness to everything that happens in this house. The arguments, the lies, the affairs. Eliza felt her heart rate quicken. Affairs? The smile that spread across Vera's face made Eliza's blood run cold. Oh yes, your father has had several over the years, discreet, of course. Your mother had her fair share too, though she was always more careful. Eliza swallowed hard, trying to process this information. Her parents' marriage had always seemed solid, if somewhat formal. That's hardly worth $2 million. Affairs are hardly shocking anymore. Vera leaned forward, her eyes glinting. But what about when the affair is with your own son-in-law? The words hung in the air between them like poison gas. Eliza felt her knees give way, sinking into the nearest chair as the room seemed to spin around her. You're lying, she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, pieces began falling into place. The lingering glances, the private jokes, the times she'd found them in deep conversation that halted abruptly when she entered the room. James and my mother? The thought was too horrible to contemplate. Going on 3 years now, Vera confirmed, seeming to take a perverse pleasure in Eliza's distress. Started right after your miscarriage. You were so depressed and Margaret was so comforting. Eliza felt physically ill. 3 years. 3 years of deception, of betrayal by the two people she trusted most in the world. There's more, Vera continued, relentless in her cruelty. Your father's gambling problem that nearly bankrupted the company 5 years ago, covered up with money from your trust fund. Your brother Thomas's stint in rehab wasn't for exhaustion, it was for cocaine addiction. Oh, and the car accident that killed your cousin Peter? Your mother was driving, not the chauffeur like they told everyone. Each revelation was a fresh wound, and Eliza found herself gasping for air. Her entire life, everything she believed to be true, was crumbling around her. Why are you doing this? She finally managed to ask. Why now, after all these years? Vera's expression hardened. I've given my life to this family. Raised you children, kept your secrets, sacrificed my own chances at happiness. And what do I have to show for it? A modest retirement fund and a thank you letter? I think I've earned a bit more than that. So this is about money. It's about what I deserve, Vera snapped. $2 million and I disappear forever, taking all these nasty secrets with me. Otherwise, I start talking. To the press, to your father's business associates, to the police about certain incidents that were covered up over the years. Eliza stood on shaky legs, her mind racing. I need to think. You have until midnight, Vera called after her as she stumbled from the room. That's when I expect an answer from your parents. The house felt different as Eliza wandered through it, as if the very walls were complicit in the deception. Every family photograph, every treasured heirloom, now seemed to mock her with their false promise of permanence and tradition. She found herself in her father's study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the lingering scent of his cigars. Robert Blackwood was still an imposing figure at 68, silver-haired and eagle-eyed. He looked up from his desk, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Eliza? What's wrong? You look terrible. She couldn't hold back anymore. Is it true that you took money from my trust fund to cover gambling debts? Robert's face went slack with shock before hardening into defensive anger. Who told you that? Vera. She's blackmailing Mother for $2 million to keep quiet about all of our family's dirty little secrets. Her father removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. Sit down, Eliza. I don't want to sit down. I want the truth. The truth, he echoed hollowly. The truth is that I made some bad investments. It wasn't gambling, not exactly. I needed to cover losses temporarily. Your trust fund was the only liquid asset available. I paid it back in full within a year, with interest. Eliza stared at him, this man she had idolized her entire life. And you didn't think I deserved to know? It was handled, he said simply, as if that explained everything. And in his world, perhaps it did. Problems were to be solved quietly, efficiently, and then never spoken of again. What about Thomas? The rehab? Robert sighed heavily. Yes, that was for addiction issues. We thought it better for his future if we kept the real reason quiet. And Peter's accident? Was Mother really driving? A flash of genuine pain crossed her father's face. That was a terrible night. Your mother had had too much to drink at the charity gala. When the police arrived, I told them Davis had been driving. The family couldn't withstand a scandal like that. Eliza felt tears welling up. So everything is about appearances? About protecting the family name, no matter the cost? You don't understand the pressure, the responsibility. Don't patronize me. I understand perfectly. The mighty Blackwoods can do whatever they want as long as no one finds out. Break laws, betray trust, have affairs. She broke off, unable to finish the thought. Robert's expression changed, a new wariness entering his eyes. What else did Vera tell you? Eliza met his gaze directly. That mother has been having an affair with James. My husband. For 3 years. The blood drained from her father's face. For a moment, he looked every one of his 68 years and then some. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I swear to you, Eliza, I didn't know about that. Somehow, she believed him. In the midst of all the lies, this helpless shock rang true. What are we going to do about Vera? She asked, suddenly exhausted. Pay her, Robert said without hesitation. It's the only way. We can't let this get out. So she just gets away with it? Takes our money and disappears. It's the price of silence. Sometimes it's worth paying. Eliza shook her head, a new determination forming. No, I'm not going to let her destroy this family and profit from it. And I'm not going to pretend none of this happened. She turned to leave, but her father's voice stopped her. Where are you going? To find my mother and my husband. It's time they faced what they've done. Margaret Blackwood was in the conservatory, arranging flowers as if it were any ordinary day. The sight of her, so poised, so perfect, sent a surge of rage through Eliza. How could you? She demanded, causing her mother to prick her finger on a rose thorn. Margaret looked up, a drop of blood welling on her fingertip. Eliza, don't. I know everything. About you and James. Margaret carefully set down her scissors, her movements deliberate. Vera told you. It wasn't a question. How could you do that to me? Your own daughter. It wasn't about you, Margaret said, her voice unnervingly calm. That's the problem with you, Mother. Nothing ever is. Eliza's voice broke. I lost my baby. I was grieving. And you took advantage of that to seduce my husband. For the first time, a crack appeared in Margaret's perfect facade. It wasn't like that. We were both in pain. You had shut everyone out, including James. It just happened. Things like that don't just happen. You made choices. Both of you. Eliza could hardly bear to look at her mother, this woman who had taught her about dignity and propriety while living a complete lie. Does father know? No, Margaret said quickly. And he can't find out. It would destroy him. Like you destroyed me? Eliza shot back. You know what's ironic? I actually feel sorry for you. You've spent your whole life crafting this perfect image, and now it's going to cost you $2 million to maintain it. Margaret's eyes flashed. We're paying Vera, and then this will all go away. You'll see that it's for the best. Nothing is going away, Mother. Especially not me. I'm going to find James now. Don't worry. I won't tell Daddy about your sordid little affair. That's your mess to clean up. As Eliza turned to leave, Margaret called after her, What are you going to do? Eliza paused in the doorway. I honestly don't know yet. But I promise you, it won't be what you expect. Finding James proved more difficult. He wasn't answering his cell phone, and his assistant at his investment firm claimed not to know his whereabouts. It wasn't until Eliza checked the garage and discovered his Audi missing that she realized he wasn't on the estate at all. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. Was he running away? Had her mother warned him? She was about to call him again when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the Willows. I can help with your Vera problem. Come alone. The Willows was a secluded spot by the lake on the edge of the Blackwood property, a small gazebo surrounded by weeping willow trees where Eliza had played as a child. Suspicious but intrigued, Eliza made her way there, following the winding path through the estate's extensive grounds. The June day was warm, birds singing in the trees, making the turmoil of her life seem even more surreal. As she approached the gazebo, a figure rose from one of the benches, her brother Thomas. At 32, Thomas was the family rebel, always pushing boundaries and testing limits. Seeing him now, Eliza was struck by how tired he looked, the boyish charm that had always gotten him out of trouble now tempered by something harder. "Thomas? Was that you who texted me?" He nodded, embracing her briefly. "I overheard mother and father arguing about Vera. Sounds like we've got a situation." Eliza sank onto a bench, suddenly overwhelmed. "That's putting it mildly. Our maid is blackmailing the family, my husband is having an affair with our mother, and apparently everyone's been lying to me my entire life." Thomas let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Liz. I knew about some of it. My rehab, Dad's financial issues, but the James and Mom thing, that's next-level betrayal." It was a relief, in a strange way, to talk to someone who understood the family dynamics, who didn't need the whole sordid history explained. "What did you mean, you can help with the Vera problem?" Thomas sat beside her, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone. "Vera's been playing this game for years, Liz. She's extorted money from me 3 times for keeping quiet about my drug use. I'm betting I'm not the only one she's blackmailed on the side." Eliza stared at her brother in shock. "Are you serious? This isn't her first time? Not even close. Think about it, she's been with the family for 30 years. That's a lot of secrets, a lot of leverage." A new understanding was dawning on Eliza. So this $2 million is just her grand finale. One last big score before she retires. Thomas nodded grimly. "Exactly. And I think we can use that against her." For the first time that day, Eliza felt a spark of hope. "How?" "We need evidence of her previous blackmail schemes. If we can prove she's been extorting the family for years, her threats lose their power. No one will believe anything she says. It'll look like the desperate actions of a disgruntled employee trying to get revenge." Eliza considered this. It could work, but how do we get that evidence? Thomas grinned, a flash of his old mischievous self. "Leave that to me. I've got recordings of 2 of our interactions. And I'm willing to bet if we start asking around, discreetly, we'll find others she's blackmailed." "Like who?" "Cousin Rachel, for starters. Remember when she suddenly broke off her engagement to that senator's son? I'd bet good money Vera knows the real reason why." A plan was beginning to form in Eliza's mind. "We need to move quickly. She gave the family until midnight to pay her. Then we better get to work." As they stood to leave, Eliza hesitated. "What about James? And Mother?" Thomas's expression sobered. "That's a separate issue. One thing at a time, sis. Let's deal with Vera first, then you can decide what to do about those 2. He was right, of course. But even as they walked back toward the house, Eliza couldn't stop the burning question. What would she do about her husband and mother once this was over? The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Thomas made calls to family members, carefully probing for information about Vera without revealing too much. Eliza searched through old family financial records, looking for unexplained withdrawals that might correspond with previous blackmail payments. By 4 o'clock, they had assembled what Thomas called their blackmail portfolio, evidence that Vera had been extorting money from various family members for at least 15 years. As Thomas had predicted, their cousin Rachel had been a victim. The real reason for her broken engagement? She'd discovered she was pregnant by another man. Vera had threatened to tell the senator's son, and Rachel had paid $50,000 for her silence. There were others too, an uncle with a secret second family, a great-aunt with a gambling problem, even their grandmother who had apparently been hiding her true age for decades. In total, they estimated Vera had collected over $500,000 through her various schemes. "She's been running a one-woman extortion racket," Thomas said, looking almost impressed despite himself. "The question is, what do we do with this information?" Eliza had been thinking about that very question. "We confront her, obviously. But we need leverage beyond just exposing her. Blackmailing a blackmailer only works if you have something they really don't want revealed. What about the police? This is criminal behavior." Eliza shook her head. "Too risky. Too many family secrets would come out in an investigation. We need something else, something personal to Vera." They were interrupted by the buzzing of Eliza's phone. James calling at last. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. "It's him," she told Thomas, who immediately stood. "I'll give you some privacy. Remember, one crisis at a time." Once her brother had left the room, Eliza answered the call. "Where are you?" she demanded without preamble. There was a pause on the other end. "I'm at the office," James said finally. "We need to talk, Eliza." "Yes, we do. I know about you and my mother." Another pause, longer this time. When James spoke again, his voice was strained. "Who told you? Does it matter? It's true, isn't it?" The silence was confirmation enough. "How could you, James? After everything we've been through." "I never meant to hurt you," he began, but Eliza cut him off. Don't you dare give me that line. You've been sleeping with my mother for 3 years. That's not a mistake or a moment of weakness. That's a choice you made, day after day." "I wanted to end it," he said, his voice breaking. "So many times. But she threatened to tell you, to tell everyone. Are you seriously trying to make yourself the victim here?" Eliza was incredulous. "You're blaming my mother?" "No, I'm not. I'm just trying to explain." "God, Eliza, I've made such a mess of everything. I still love you." The words, which once would have meant everything to her, now rang hollow. "Don't come home," she said coldly. "Not tonight. I can't even look at you right now." "What about Vera? Your mother told me about the blackmail." Of course she had. They were still conspiring, still protecting each other. "Thomas and I are handling it. Just stay away, James." "I mean it." She ended the call, her hands shaking with anger and grief. It would be so easy to fall apart right now, to give in to the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. But there wasn't time. She had a blackmailer to deal with. As evening fell, Eliza and Thomas finalized their plan. They would confront Vera together, present their evidence of her previous extortion schemes, and offer her a choice: leave immediately with a reasonable severance package, or face exposure and possible criminal charges. What they still lacked was that personal leverage, something that would ensure Vera's compliance beyond just the threat of exposure. It was Thomas who found it, buried in old staff records their father kept in his study. "Look at this," he said, showing Eliza a yellowed document. Vera's original employment application from 30 years ago. The name she gave was Vera Holloway, but her social security number belongs to someone named Vera Davenport, who, according to public records, died in 1972. Eliza looked up from the paper, understanding dawning. She's been using a dead woman's identity? For 30 years. Thomas nodded, excitement in his eyes. Identity theft, social security fraud, those are serious federal crimes with serious jail time. This is our leverage. Armed with this new information, they decided to confront Vera before the midnight deadline. As they approached her quarters, Eliza felt a strange calm settle over her. After a day of emotional turmoil, she was finally taking action, taking control. Thomas knocked on the door, and when Vera answered, her expression changed from irritation to wariness at the sight of both siblings. "Miss Eliza." "Mr. Thomas. What can I do for you?" Thomas smiled coldly. "I think it's more what we can do for you, Vera. Or should I say, whoever you really are." They pushed past her into the room, Thomas closing the door firmly behind them. "What is this about?" Vera demanded, but Eliza could see fear beginning to creep into her eyes. "We know everything," Eliza said simply. "About how you've been blackmailing family members for years. About how you've been living under a false identity, using a dead woman's social security number." Vera's face drained of color. "That's absurd. Save it," Thomas interrupted, laying out documents on her small table, the evidence they had gathered throughout the day. 15 years of extortion, carefully documented. Plus identity theft and fraud. "You're looking at decades in prison, Vera." The maid sank into a chair, her usual confidence evaporating. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Eliza leaned forward. "We want you gone. Tonight. No $2 million, no scandal, no more threats. You leave with the standard severance package for a long-term employee. Generous, but nowhere near what you were demanding, and you never contact anyone in this family again. And if I refuse? Vera's voice was barely a whisper. Thomas smiled coldly. Then we take all of this to the FBI. I'm sure they'd be very interested in someone who's been living under a false identity for 3 decades. Vera looked from Thomas to Eliza, searching for any sign of bluff or weakness. Finding none, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I'll need time to pack, she said finally. You have 2 hours, Eliza replied. A car will take you to a hotel for the night. Your severance will be wired to your account tomorrow, after we're certain you haven't contacted any press or authorities. As they turned to leave, Vera called out, What about your mother and husband? Their affair? Don't you want revenge for that? Eliza paused, looking back at the woman who had been a fixture in her life for as long as she could remember. My personal life is no longer any of your concern. Unlike you, I don't use other people's pain for profit. Outside in the hallway, Thomas gave her an admiring look. That was impressive, sis. I'm not sure I would have had your restraint. Eliza sighed, the weight of the day finally catching up with her. It's not over yet. I still have to deal with James and Mother. Thomas squeezed her shoulder. Whatever you decide, I've got your back. Want me to handle Vera's departure while you figure out your next move? She nodded gratefully. Thanks, Thomas. I think I need some air. Eliza found herself drawn back to the willows as night fell, the gazebo a pale ghost in the moonlight. This had always been her thinking place, her refuge when the expectations and pretensions of the Blackwood family became too much. Tonight, however, she wasn't alone for long. A familiar figure approached along the path, her father. Your brother told me I might find you here, Robert said, settling beside her on the bench. He also told me about Vera. You two handled that impressively. Eliza accepted the compliment with a nod. She was never going to stop. This was the only way. They sat in silence for a moment, the chirping of crickets the only sound. I spoke with your mother, Robert said finally. She told me everything. About her and James. Eliza turned to look at her father, surprised. She did? In the moonlight, she could see the lines of pain etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. I asked her directly. After you confronted her, she knew it was only a matter of time before I found out. I'm sorry, Dad. And she was sorry that her father was hurting, sorry that their family had come to this. Don't be. None of this is your fault. Robert took her hand in his. The question now is, what do you want to do about it? Eliza had been asking herself that same question all day. I don't know if my marriage can survive this. Or even if I want it to. That's understandable. But don't make any permanent decisions tonight. Give yourself time to process everything. His advice was sound, even if it came from a man who had spent his life avoiding difficult truths. What about you and Mother? She asked. Robert sighed heavily. 40 years of marriage isn't easily discarded, even after something like this. We have a lot to work through. Eliza couldn't help but admire his resilience, his willingness to at least try to salvage something from the wreckage. Did you really not know about them? I suspected something was wrong, he admitted. Your mother has been distant, distracted. But I never imagined this. He gestured vaguely, unable to put the betrayal into words. What will you do now? Robert's face hardened with resolve. First, I'm going to make sure Vera leaves quietly. Your brother is watching her pack, but I want to personally see her off the property. After that, he shrugged. One day at a time, I suppose. After her father left, Eliza remained at the gazebo, watching the moon's reflection ripple on the lake's surface. So much had changed in a single day. The family she thought she knew had been revealed as a collection of secrets and lies. And yet, there was something almost liberating about having everything exposed. No more pretense, no more perfect facade. Just the messy, complicated truth. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Vera gone. All handled. You okay? She texted back a simple yes before turning her attention back to the water. Was she okay? Not really. But she would be. The sound of footsteps on the path made her tense, but she didn't turn around. She knew who it was. Your mother told me I'd find you here, James said, his voice hesitant. I know you said not to come home, but I couldn't stay away. Not with everything falling apart. Eliza still didn't turn to look at him. It fell apart 3 years ago. We're just now noticing the damage. He moved closer, stopping at the gazebo steps. I don't expect forgiveness, Eliza. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know how sorry I am. Now she did turn, studying the man she had pledged to spend her life with. He looked awful, hair disheveled, eyes red-rimmed, his usual confident posture replaced by a defeated slump. Why her? She asked, the question that had been burning inside her all day. Was it to hurt me? To get back at me for something? James shook his head miserably. It wasn't about you at all. That's what makes it so unforgivable. After the miscarriage, when you were so lost in grief, I felt invisible. Your mother was there, offering comfort, understanding. It just happened. The same excuse her mother had given. It just happened. As if affairs were natural disasters, unpredictable and unpreventable. I shut down after losing the baby, Eliza acknowledged. I was in pain. But instead of helping me through it, you turned to my mother for comfort. She laughed bitterly. Do you have any idea how twisted that is? I do now, he said quietly. I've spent the day driving around, trying to figure out how I let things go so far, how I betrayed the one person I truly love. Eliza stood, needing to create distance between them. Love isn't supposed to hurt like this, James. What can I do? He asked, desperation in his voice. How can I make this right? Eliza looked at him for a long moment. I don't think you can. Some things can't be fixed. Are you saying our marriage is over? The pain in his voice was real, but Eliza couldn't let that sway her. I'm saying I don't know what happens next. I need time. Space. A lot of it. James nodded slowly. I understand. I'll stay at the city apartment for as long as you need. He turned to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, it ended months ago. The affair. We both knew it was wrong, that it had to stop. But the damage was already done, Eliza said softly. Yes, he agreed. The damage was done. After he left, Eliza remained at the gazebo until well past midnight, thinking about her parents, her brother, her husband, and the woman who had nearly destroyed them all. The Blackwood family would survive this crisis, as they had survived others before. But it would never be the same. Perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The perfect family image had been shattered, but maybe something more authentic could emerge from the pieces. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Eliza finally made her way back to the house. In the kitchen, she found Thomas sitting at the counter, a pot of coffee brewing. Couldn't sleep, she asked, sliding onto a stool beside him. Too much adrenaline, he admitted. Plus, I wanted to make sure you were okay. Eliza smiled at her brother, grateful for his support throughout this ordeal. I will be. Eventually. Thomas poured them both coffee. So what now? Back to normal. Eliza shook her head. No, not normal. Better than normal. Honest, at least. That's a tall order for this family, Thomas said with a wry smile. But I'm game if you are. They clinked their mugs together in a toast to truth, to new beginnings, to the uncertain but hopeful future ahead. 2 weeks later, Eliza stood in the doorway of her newly rented apartment, surveying the sparse furnishings and blank walls. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a space untainted by lies or betrayal. The decision to move out of the family estate had come gradually, a recognition that she needed distance to heal and decide her next steps. Her parents were in counseling, working through their issues with professional help. Her father had approached her with uncharacteristic vulnerability, asking for her forgiveness for the years of deception. Her mother found it harder to apologize directly, but was making efforts in her own way, respecting Eliza's boundaries, offering support without smothering. James had given her the space she requested, sending just one letter expressing his remorse and his hope that someday they might at least be able to talk again. Thomas had surprised everyone by checking himself into a wellness retreat, committing fully to his sobriety and mental health. And Vera? True to her word, she had disappeared completely. The generous severance package, far less than her blackmail demand, but still substantial, had apparently been enough to buy her silence. As Eliza unpacked her belongings in her new home, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The day of reckoning, with all its pain and revelations, had ultimately been a gift. It had stripped away the pretense and forced everyone to confront the truth about themselves, about each other, about the facade they had maintained for so long. Her phone rang. Thomas calling to check in. "How's the new place?" he asked when she answered. "It's perfect," she replied, meaning it. "I'm having dinner with Dad tonight. Want to join us?" "I'd like that," he said. "Hey, Liz? For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Standing up to Vera, standing up for yourself with James and Mom. You're stronger than all of us put together." Eliza smiled, touched by her brother's words. "We're all stronger than we thought," she said. As she ended the call and continued unpacking, Eliza reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The family secrets had been exposed, the perfect image shattered. But in its place was something real, flawed, complicated, but genuine. And that, she decided, was worth more than any facade of perfection. The price of silence had been high, but the reward of truth was immeasurable.